My name is Kelly McCoy. I'm the African Program Manager at Global Family Travels, and I have a huge heart for Africa. I've been traveling to the continent for over the last 18 years or so. And there's so many different ways to explore Africa, the amazing destinations through our Global Family Travels Learn, Serve, and Immerse pillars. We offer experiences that will connect you with people and communities that we work in throughout the continent. In addition to what is known as the classic safari, our journeys also include culturally engaging experiences, wildlife viewing, conservation activities, and really getting you and your family immersed in the flora, fauna, some active adventures like hiking and cycling, as well as some culinary opportunities, just to name a few. So, our mission today is to really share with you two key things. First, how to plan a meaningful family safari, and secondly, to share our high level, our several experiences in destinations on the continent. Our time together today will be really casual and open, so feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer those questions as we go along. And if we miss anything, we'll definitely cover it at the end. And with that, I'd like to now introduce you to Jennifer Spots, who is the founder and CEO of Global Family Travels. Hey, Jennifer.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. Kelly and I had the opportunity to travel to Africa, to Zimbabwe together, and I always just love learning from Kelly, as she's knows the continent well, and excited that you'll be learning from her today. I'm the founder of Global Family Travels. We're based in Bellevue, Washington. We're almost 13-year-old company. And I like to call Global Family Travels my third child. I nurturing it even through COVID. We're thankful to have survived. And, we really look at travel or in the tourism industry as a way to authentically connect with the destination and really support all of the things happening in the destination. Of course, the people, the nature, and the connection of people to nature, and in Africa especially. So just a few things about our approach to how we put together trips. We work oftentimes in partnership with nonprofit organizations through our three travel pillars of learn, serve, and immerse. And basically, obviously, when you travel, you learn a lot about the destination, the history, the culture, the heritage, and so oftentimes you learn about yourself. Because of the authentic, the connections with the nonprofit organizations, we are able oftentimes to have the community say, we have some needs in our community, conservation, and so put together some experiences that are both immersive and that support the destination. I call this community tourism, and also it's known as regenerative tourism too. We do quite a few donor trips to India, Nepal, and other destinations, and we launched a few experiences in Seattle as well. And of course, our African safaris, and we work with a few clients who are doing some around the world trips with purpose. And a lot of these are transformational experiences. So next slide, Kelly. And we're very lucky to work with some amazing nonprofits, and we do the due diligence of the work of the nonprofits in the destinations that we work with, and several of them are in Africa, and Kelly will share those with you. And the next slide, Kelly. I think, yes. If you haven't heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 goals. The ultimate goal is no poverty. And so we oftentimes align several of our trips around these goals, and look at how we can be better travelers or citizens of the world around these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to help make a difference. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly because she has a lot to share. And I thank you for joining us. And we'll send this recording out to those of you who registered and weren't able to dial in today. Thank you.
I always like to share a little bit. Thank you, Jennifer. I always like to share a little bit about Africa. And I know some people have visited the continent and some people may have not. But the reason why I love Africa is because it's so diverse. There's so many different cultures and different landscapes. And I always get asked, do you ever get tired of going on wildlife adventures? And my answer is always no, because you can see so many different things based on the time of year and when you go and where you're going. So really quick, Africa is kind of broken up into 6 regions, starting from north to south. There's northern Africa that covers everything from the Morocco to Egypt. Then there's the Saharan Africa, also known as the Sahel, that covers from west to east, Mauritania through Sudan. And then there's West Africa in the emerald green. Then we go down to the heart of Africa, which is Central Africa. That includes the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, as well as Angola, just to mention a few. And then where we're going to focus on most of our time today is in Eastern Africa, which is the red section that includes the countries of Tanzania, Rwanda, Somalia, including down in the ocean, the island of Madagascar, as well as Southern Africa, which includes the countries of South Africa, Lesotho, just to mention a few as well. And as I mentioned, Africa is kind of known as the cradle of civilization. And bear with me for a second as I dial. And modern humans originated from Africa, and there's more diversity on the continent of Africa than all the other continents combined. And from this is kind of a great article that was in National Geographic back in 2018 that kind of covers and shows a great example of the different people groups that are on the continent. 99% said that 99% of all of our DNA is about the same, and that it originated with humans on the African continent. And from all these people groups, this was from the same article on National Geographic, comes all the diversity that is in the world throughout migration trails of peoples and human groups out of the continent of Africa. And I always like to share a really high level, history of the modern safari, or the history of safari up through what today is known as the modern safari. And safari comes from the Arabic verb safar, which means to make journey. The Swahili translation of that, which is a language in Eastern Africa, is journey. And in the beginning, if you look at the right, this is an example, a map of old trade routes that date back to 200 BC through about 1500, and all the different, back in the original safari periods, all of the journeys were done primarily for trade of, precious metals and spices, as well as, unfortunately, people. But this just gives you a view of the different migration paths, the different uh, language speaking groups traveled throughout the continent. Today, throughout the 15th, after the 15th through 18th century, that is when the modern or the classic safari was born. Trading, was profitable, and that was also during the Atlantic slave trade from the continent of Africa into the Americas. And after the 18th century, it was the 19th century where European safari caravans were large scale expeditions that were primarily for extraction from the continent, but also scientists started joining these expeditions as well and discovering what were new species. Hmm. Jennifer, I think you have accidentally muted me. Can you hear me? Okay. So in the 19th century, as I was mentioning, this is when the more classic safari came about. And if many of you are familiar with like Out of Africa from Isaac Denison, that is also where colonial settlers started coming into Eastern Africa and made the wildlife safari a very popular um, expedition or adventure. And so during the 19th and early 20th centuries, you will have many Europeans as well as the upper classes from the United States who could afford to take the big journeys to game hunt as well as learn about the different species of animals and flora, fauna. And that's what happened during the 19th century. And then during that period, through the big game hunts, conservation was actually born. And people like Teddy Roosevelt and the conservationist Sulis, who actually has a national park named after him in southern Tanzania. All of these folks started realizing that perhaps we're hunting too much, and perhaps the exportation of different species to zoos and the remains to museums around the world was putting pressure on the environment. So within Africa, mostly due to the British, national parks started becoming settled. And it's one of the British were the first to start setting aside land that they had settled in order to conserve the wildlife and the parks. And that also became the blueprint for what we know today in the United States as national parks that are set aside. Unfortunately, along with some of these naturalists and men of science, as well as the hunters, we also became kind of the forced migration that happened with our indigenous groups here in the United States, also happened with indigenous groups in different countries in the African continent as well. And so today, from some of those conservation efforts and hunting, for the most part in most countries, is no longer happening in national parks. It is happening in some places in southern Africa. Mostly, what we know today as a safari is more of a pure wildlife viewing adventure that gives opportunities to get people engaged with the communities that surround the national parks that we're visiting. I don't think, in my experience and traveling with people, most people don't know that some of the communities that surround national parks have never even stepped into a national park. And we're happy that we partner with different organizations in different countries on the continent that actually give access to the local communities and national parks. So that's what it's all about today. It's really about connecting with the community, understanding, viewing the ecosystems and lifestyles and cultures that make up the communities around the different parks in various countries. And so, with that, I have about 10 different tips to kind of share for planning a meaningful African adventure. And the first thing that we talk about is really using a travel advisor. Whether you want to travel in the next few months or the next year, our travel advisors help you navigate the added safety and nuances for a destination, is really help you kind of focus in and based off of your family's desires of what they want to see, what kind of activities you may want to participate in. Travel advisors can help you do that, especially with COVID that we've just gone through in the last 2 years. A lot of visa information has constantly been changing. Routing with air suppliers that we typically use has changed. And as countries open back up, travel advisors can help you and your family navigate that. The one thing that we pay specific attention to is we, as Global Family Travels, have our own COVID-19 and pandemic health and safety protocols, and we are constantly working with our partners on the ground to make sure that they're up to date as well. And so that's the benefit of using a travel advisor, is making sure that you maximize your dollar, your time, and we help you navigate a country in the safest manner possible. The other thing to really consider is creating a plan and picking your destination. Many people want to travel to multiple destinations while they're on the continent, and so we can help you navigate that. We like to say, stay, in one place a longer amount of time so you really get to connect. But we have flexibility to help you do both things if you only have so much amount of time to get to a place. So really helping you understanding working side by side with you to understand what you want to plan for activities while you're in a country, whether that's cities as well as being out in the national parks or other rural areas. We can help that. Um, and so, really planning that out anywhere from 6 to 9 months out, or 9 to 12 months out, depending on how many people are going. We've had small families grow, 2 people, 4 people. We've had as many as 12 people go. So, that's what we really focus on. And a lot of people ask, when is the right time to go? Well, it just kind of depends on what you want to see. And like if you're a birder, wintertime is a great time to be anywhere in Africa because of the migration patterns of birds. Southern Africa is known, you can pretty much go to Southern Africa all year round. Whereas East Africa, there's definitely distinguishable dry and wet seasons. And so we kind of help you navigate through that, again, based off of what your family's needs are. And the other thing to really consider is the age of travelers. So on most safaris, most operators, and we highly suggest that as far as the youngest age would be 6 and above, just because of the safety of safari vehicles, being out in open spaces with animals. Most of our lodge accommodations don't have fences necessarily, and so being in a place where a child is really aware, anything younger that makes that a little bit more difficult. We can make arrangements. We've had families that travel with toddlers, however, make different arrangements when it comes to actually being out in a national park. And so, pretty much all of our safari partners and tour operators can help make those different arrangements as well. For example, we had a multi generational family in South Africa that was traveling, and one of the activities actually was a bike ride. And they had a child that was about 3 years old. And so instead of the entire family going on a bike ride, the grandmother and grandbaby actually went behind in a vehicle. So there's different things that we can do there, but really consider the age of the different travelers, whether that's elders that might be in the group as well as children under 6. And then our next thing that we always keep in mind, and I mentioned a minute ago, is really go slow and keep it simple. A safari is not an experience you want to rush, and so we suggest traveling slower and spending more time at each stop on your itinerary. Focusing on one country, gives more time in each place and allows fewer interactions with other travelers if you just kind of want to be with your family and spend more time that way versus spending time at multiple airports or train stations, etc. And a minimum amount of time is we always suggest is about 2 weeks to explore while you're on safari, and that gives you time to get if you're coming from as far as Seattle or somewhere in the United States, it gives your body time to acclimate with the time change, etc. And then the other thing that we always want people to think about is consider the abilities and interest of each family member. There's so many different activities we can do while we're out in a national park, whether that's hiking, whether there's boating or water experiences like kayaking. In some cases, we can arrange for horseback riding with different operators. And some folks are interested in going up in an air balloon, some are not. Some are interested in mountain biking, which is available in some of the places that we go. So those are the kinds of things to consider, what's really important, and how much time you want to spend on community projects. Most of our community engagement experiences are anywhere from half a day, like 2 half days within a destination, or 1 full day. It really kind of depends on what the community needs are at the time. But that is also something that we'll walk you through and ask you questions about. And then on that same note, when you're looking for cultural opportunities to engage and support local communities, these are the kind of different, we'll be going through examples as we go through destinations, whether you want to spend time with educational opportunities, whether there's time with agro opportunities. For example, we had a group that was out near Kruger National Park that worked with an eco farm in that community that was just outside the park. So those are some things to consider as well. Any questions so far? Jennifer, can you check the chat for me and let me know? So our next couple of tips are making sure that your safari supports wildlife conservation and local people. In many cases, there are safari operators that really the money doesn't stay in the community, or does it help conservation or give back? And so what we do when we vet our partners is we really look for locally owned tour operators, as well as our NGOs that are actually based in the actual community you spend time in, and have board members that live in the places that we partner with. So, for example, in Tanzania, our nonprofit partner, the project is based in Karatu, which is just outside of the Ngorongoro crater and on the way to the Serengeti. And their board members all live in that area, even though the nonprofit has a US based address and the founder is from the United States. So those are the kind of things that we look for so that everything impacts the local community and it's community centered. The other thing that we also keep in mind, especially coming through the pandemic, is most places on the African continent were some of the first places to be shut down during the lockdown, and that impacted the economic opportunities and jobs for a lot of people in those areas, as well as it impacted the conservation of animals in some of the national parks. In some countries where there were fewer rangers that were in the parks, poaching started on the uptick again. So those are the kinds of things that tourism helps out with different communities. The other thing that to keep in mind is flexibility. Having come through COVID, like I mentioned, a lot of some of the visa requirements changed for US citizens going into certain countries in Africa, like Tanzania changed dramatically and now it's flipped back. So we watch those things all the time. The other thing that we want to make sure is that, again, everyone travels in a healthy manner, in a safe manner, and having that flexibility. We make you aware of that as we work with you shoulder to shoulder and looking at kind of what you want your adventure to be. And so that might mean using trains, using cars. Again, the one thing that we looked at is kind of where national parks go and what national parks were impacted not only through the pandemic but also with climate change. So, like for example, in Tanzania, we flipped one of the parks that we usually go to because climate change has really impacted in what you will see versus what you won't see. And then the last thing that we really have people focus on is making sure through the experience of COVID is to ensure that you do have travel insurance. It's one thing to make sure that your trip is protected should you have to cancel because of an illness, or if we go through another pandemic like we have, at least your trip is covered and your investment of your trip is covered as well. And so just really traveling with that safety in mind and being protected is another key thing to think about. And just a couple of other things before I go into the next section. The next session is really to think about sleeping arrangements. One of the things that some people aren't aware of if they're traveling with teenagers is, again, for cautions of our large partners, we always require that one adult is sleeping with a child that is underage, meaning under the age of 18. So if there is a family groups, what happens sometimes is sometimes the parents might split up, or sometimes we can arrange a family room where everyone's in the same space. So those are different things to consider. The other thing to consider when traveling with a family is think about meals and meal times and what dietary requirements are suitable and agreeable to everyone, because we can arrange around those as well. And then transportation. When you're planning transportation in Africa, especially with younger children, what you might want to consider is comfort levels. If your kids don't really enjoy long road trips at home and are prone to travel sickness, you might want to consider internal flights from one place to another place versus a long road trip. Because usually some of the roads, depending on what country you're in Africa, are going to be uncomfortable, bumpy, and the ride might be a little slower than maybe what you're used to at home. If you're considering a guided excursion or a package, look carefully at those modes of transportation and make sure that they would work with, the needs of your family. So these are things to factor in as well. The other thing to think about is how much walking, hiking might be involved, and is that realistic for everyone in the party? Um, and then let's see, the other thing we talked about is really safety in a wildlife setting, especially again traveling with younger children, is just making sure that kind of a parent's head is on a swivel and kind of being aware of where that child is. Sometimes in some of our lodges we have swimming pools, for example, that don't have fences, and so if children are not swimmers yet, just making sure that they're accompanied in the pool area at all times or refrain from going in the pool area. And then just every single country is a little bit different as far as general health and water and what immunizations are needed. And so what we can do is help you guide you along through each of our destinations. And we really encourage everyone to bring their own water bottle. We do try to avoid using plastic on our trips, and potable water in most destinations. If you're in rural areas, specifically like out in national parks, is the one thing that you're going to really want to be aware of. Um, and then, as far as immunizations go, really we suggest that every family work with their private healthcare, their doctor, because everyone is different. And the needs in general, as far as immunizations go, vary by country, but for the most part, hepatitis A, typhoid, malaria, and MMR vaccinations are generally required for most places in Africa. And depending on how you're traveling within the continent, you may need to have a yellow fever immunization as well, depending on where you're coming into a country from. And then other things to really think about is making sure what we've experienced in the last year is the length of time it takes to get the proper, if you have to renew your passport. It's taken a lot longer in 2022 than it has in the past couple of years. So just really planning ahead for that and making sure every family member is up to date on their passport, or the same thing with some of our visa applications, which have changed since COVID. Some places you used to be able to get your visa at the border, and now some places have changed that where you need to do it online in advance. So those are the other things that we can keep you abreast of as well. Um, and then let's see the other. So now I'm going to share a little bit about our different destinations. So for Global Family Travels, we traveled to Rwanda, Tanzania, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And so new in 2023 is our Rwanda Women's and Empowerment Adventure. And this is 10 days and 9 nights. And essentially, we start off in the city of Kigali. We head out to a couple of different national parks, Nguwe National Park and Akagera National Park. And this adventure is in February 2nd through February 11th. It's about $39.85 per person. And we, because of the focus on women's empowerment and the subject of the history of Rwanda, which will also include the genocide of 1994. This trip is perfect for adults and young adults aged 16 and up. And for those that are interested, we do offer an extension of 2 days for a guerrilla trekking experience. And personally, I've done guerrilla trekking a couple of times, and it's a pretty amazing and exhilarating experience. And so, for those not as not as familiar with the continent of Africa or the different countries, Rwanda actually sits in the heart of Africa. It's the most western country in Eastern Africa and just across from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Um, and so, our trip, the learning and immersive themes of this tour include the history of Rwanda with a focus on the healing from genocide through peace and the reconciliation um, movements that actually have uplifted and empowered the women in the country. And women's empowerment and sustainability development are the key themes that we focus on, as well as you'll be exposed to different NGOs that are helping to uplift girls through education, which prior to the genocide, traditionally, this was a very patriarchal society, and now it's much more inclusive than what it's historically known as. And so we have experiences from urban to rural during this adventure that give you a deep understanding of how Rwanda is now seen as a global leader for the economic and political empowerment of women. Rwanda actually is one of the countries where majority, more than 60% of people in the government are women. Participating in this, participants of this trip will also take in the stunning natural views of Ingwe Forest and Akagera National Park, and experience life in Rwanda from the lens of women's NGOs and businesses to cultural heritage and art, including a women's drumming troupe. And there's experiences where you can actually have something that we call from crop to cup, and a tree plant, a tea planting and harvesting experience. And so, throughout the itinerary, we will be getting connected with different NGOs and be side by side with them, getting to know locals as well as learning about what they have done to help support the community in the country. And so, day one is the day that you arrive in Rwanda, but day two is where we start our day, and we get a history lesson from a local national historian in Rwanda that takes us through the history from before colonialism up through modern times right now. And then after we spend time with that historian, we will make our way to the Genocide Museum and then spend the rest of the day on a guided tour of the city of Kigali. Then on day three, we will be visiting with the Nyamurambo Women's Center and the Mbutu Foundation. We'll be doing a walking tour with the Women's Center in that community in Kigali. Then we'll be exploring one of the oldest residential areas in the city as well. Whoops, getting a little bit further ahead. Sorry, bear with me. There we go. So then our next day, we visit the FA Girls School, and FA stands for the Forum of African Women Educationalists. FA is actually an organization that's a nonprofit all over Pan Africa, and one of their chapters is in Rwanda. So we'll be spending time with this organization, and as they share a little bit about the education of girls in the country, as well as different initiatives that they're working on at the time. After we spend time with Fa, we'll be heading out to Sheila's Honey, which is a local farmers co-op that is run by women, and it's 100% produced, made, and honey in the area. And then after that, will be the first opportunity to actually take some time out to shop in the largest market in Rwanda, in Kigali, called Kimironko. And so we'll be spending some time there. It's a great place to connect and experience food and all the different types of shopping that happen in the local market there. And then on day five, after breakfast, we start heading out southwest from the city center, where we go out to Nyangwe National Park. And on the way there, we'll be passing through Nyanza and Huye, which are pre-colonial kingdom centers, and they were palaces prior to the colonization in the 19th century or the 18th century. And through there, once we visit that area, then we will be spending time in the afternoon and have an immersive lunch with the Ingonama Nishia, which is the all woman drumming group, which prior to the genocide, all drumming groups were all male. And so this was the first group of women drummers. And drumming is a very integral part of the community. It's a way of communicating and celebrating in different cultures throughout Africa. And so we'll be learning a little bit more about what that means to Rwandese people with this women's group. And we'll be, again, having an opportunity to break bread with the members of this group as well as engage in some of what they're doing, having a little drumming lesson after they have their performance. And then after that, we'll be heading into the Ingongwe Forest Reserve, where there's an opportunity to experience a canopy walk through the forest. And there is also an opportunity to have a tea tour and experience the tea farm as well as harvesting the tea and enjoying the tea. And then on our next day, we'll be visiting the Intirama and the Nyamata Genocide Memorial Churches, which are a very humbling and moving experience. The Nyamata Memorial is where over 45,000 people were laid to rest in mass graves from the genocide. And then after that, we'll spend time in the Reconciliation Village to witness firsthand how genocide survivors as well as genocide perpetrators return to living side by side in the same village. And you'll see this actually throughout the country of where there has been peace and reconciliation and how people have reunified after all this time. And so that's our day 7. And then on our next day, we will be heading back up northeast in the country and be visiting Akagera National Park. On the way there, we'll be spending time on our route there. We'll stop off at the Agoza Shalon Youth Village Center, which was set up in 2008, and it helps to give structure to youth who were orphaned because of the genocide. And so we'll be spending time learning about this organization and spending time with the children there as well. You'll also have an opportunity along the way to Akagera to visit the Sustainable Growers Co-op, which is basically a coffee co-op. And coffee is another export along with tea from Rwanda. You'll get a tour of the coffee farm as well as understand the whole process of growing the coffee. And then the last stop on this day will be at the Orugo Women's Opportunity Center. And this was actually an organization that was set up by Women for Women International, which is a partner of Bloomberg Philanthropies out of New York. The center provides a safe environment and has dedicated facilities for women to learn and build new skills and become entrepreneurs. And so that will be another interesting community engagement piece on this trip. And we'll arrive in the area of Akagera National Park in time for dinner and relax within a lodge. And then the next day, we have a full safari game drive throughout the park that goes from north to south. And there'll be time for a morning game drive as well as experience wildlife at different times of the day, and you'll see different activities. And then after our game drive, we return back to Kigali, and then the next day is the day of departure. But if you wanted to stay on, there is a 2-day extension to head out of Kigali back to the western central part of Rwanda and do some gorilla trekking in Volcanoes National Park. And again, that is for you have to have some stamina, you have to know how to hike. And actually, I had this experience in 2008, and is actually why I learned to hike so that I could be able to get up the mountain and spend about an hour with habituated gorillas in their natural environment. And so another really neat experience. And so that is our Rwanda adventure, and our partners there are the Kazi Rwanda, as well as the Niyarambo Women's Center, the FA Rwanda chapter, and the Mbutu Foundation. Any questions on Rwanda before I go to South Africa? No? Okay. So our next adventure that we uh, go to is South Africa, and that's our cities and safari tour. It's 11 days and 10 nights with an optional extension of an additional 2 days in Botswana and Chobe National Park. And this itinerary starts off in Johannesburg, goes out to Kruger National Park, then there's an internal flight down to Cape Town. And if you stay on for Chobe, then you'll be flown back up to Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, and then there's a road transfer into into Botswana for Chobe National Park. And typically, we can arrange for custom dates. Like I said, South Africa, you can travel there all year round. It's pretty temperate climate, so we can work individually with you on that. Um, and so, just to kind of give you an idea for those who are not familiar with South Africa, we start off up here in Johannesburg and head up to Kruger National Park and then fly all the way back down to Cape Town. And the flight there is about 2.5 hours. It's like as if you were going from Seattle down to San Francisco as far as length goes. Um, And so, kind of our key learning themes here is really the local lifestyles of South Africans from cities, from townships, and rural communities, and also learning and understanding the effects of apartheid through firsthand experiences of people in District 6 as well as people in Soweto. There's a couple of different community experiences in those two places. And then also learn and appreciate the concept of Ubuntu and engage in nuances of etiquette and communication in South African culture. And the concept of Ubuntu, which originated, I believe, in Southern Africa, but you will find it in different African countries, is really the connection that just the philosophy that we are all connected and we are all one. And so that's what that's about at a very high level. There's also included in this experience a visit to Robben Island, where anti apartheid activists were imprisoned. And that day culminates actually with dinner and conversation with either an ex prisoner of Robben Island or an ex guard. And then lastly, there's also included a safari in Kruger National Park, but we take that route from Johannesburg via the Panorama route. And so our first experience in South Africa kicks off in Johannesburg. We include a visit to the Kliptown Open Air Museum, which is where the Freedom Charter was signed in 1955. And if you're not familiar with apartheid, I equate it to very much the civil rights movement in the United States that was happening a little bit later than when apartheid was happening. And so Johannesburg and Soweto is kind of the heartbeat of that movement and the heartbeat of the country. And Soweto also has a street where two Nobel Peace Laureates at one time lived, and that would be Archbishop Desmond Tutu as well as Nelson Mandela. And so there's a lot of historic places in and around Soweto, and you will be taking that tour with a local guide that lives in the area and more than likely grew up during the time of apartheid and will share first hand what it was like to live during that time in the area and what it's like to live today. And so after we spend time, one of the kind of key community highlights actually in Soweto is where you have a lunch. And Jennifer and I were there a couple of years ago, and we had lunch with a family as well as a couple of community members. And you will have a time to just sit down and break bread and just talk about the events of the day that are happening in South Africa, that are happening in your home. There's a language exchange that happens, and it's a pretty engaging and moving time to spend with people in the local community, and get to kind of understand each other and understand kind of what day in the life is in Soweto. We leave Johannesburg and then we head again northeast up on the panorama route to Kruger National Park, and along the way there'll be stops. Typically it's a 4-hour drive, but for our itinerary we make it a full day, so we can get out at places like Burke's Luck Potholes, which is kind of similar to the Grand Canyon. It's a gorge area with different waterways that have carved the way through. It's pretty beautiful. And then we arrive in our lodge in Kruger National Park, just outside of Kruger National Park, at around dinner time. So you have plenty of time to relax and unwind from a day on the road. And then we have basically 2 game drives in Kruger National Park. One's in the morning and one's afternoon. They typically are in safari vehicles, but if there is a wish to have a walking safari, we can arrange that as well. And so we have 2 day drives there, and then we also have 2 half days of community service areas. And so for this destination, we work with an organization called Africa Impact, and we really take time to understand what your family wants to participate in as far as community service goes. And then we also look for Africa Impact to guide us on what does the community need, and we try to marry those two needs and desires. So that's a little bit of what that looks like. After we spend time in Kruger National Park, then we fly back down to Cape Town, and we spend the rest of our adventure there. We will basically have 2 half days of community service. This experience also includes a bicycle tour of a township, and that could change whether it's Masafumele, I can never say that right, pardon me, Masafumele, as well. It might change to a different township, whether that be Longo or another one. And what this is there's actually a community member from the township that actually gives the bicycle tour of the township, so you get to see and understand what the township is and why it's really important. And you also get to have lunch at a local township restaurant. Our time in Cape Town also includes a Cape Malay cooking class in Bo-Kaap, which is the Malay community. And you'll be visiting with someone who is a chef in the area at her home, and actually learning how to make your dinner, as well as break bread with her at dinner as well. And that basically kind of wraps up our time in South Africa. And then if you want to see one more national park, Botswana is about a 2-hour flight and an hour road drive away. And so there's an extension to visit Chobe National Park on Botswana. And that includes a lot more of a safari kind of along the river, where you'll see more hippos in the water, that kind of a thing. So that, in a nutshell, is our South Africa Cities and Safari experience. And our partners in South Africa are Editours Africa, and they are based in Cape Town, but they serve destinations actually throughout the continent, as well as Fafama Initiatives, which is our partner in Johannesburg, and Africa Impact, which is out in Kruger National Park. Then our next destination is Tanzania, and we basically have about 9 days, 8 nights. With if you want to tag on one more national park, that would also be up to 10 days and 9 nights at Lake Manyara National Park. And essentially, this itinerary covers the Kilimanjaro area for a little bit, Tarangire National Park, Karatu, the Ngorongoro Crater, and the Serengeti National Park. And we typically run this trip in the spring and summer, basically during spring break, right before it gets too rainy in Tanzania, and then summertime. And basically, so that's basically our trip there. And to give you a visual of Tanzania, it's the most eastern and largest coastal country in East Africa. It's surrounded by Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, uh, the Congo, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique. And basically, there are like three different safari circuits within Tanzania. The one that most people know about and the one that we service is what we call the Northern Circuit of Tanzania that includes Ngorongoro and borders Kenya. Um, and so that's, I can go to our next slide actually, and it gives you an idea on the map. Bear with me. Here we go. And so we start off by arriving at Kilimanjaro International Airport, and then we head down to actually the Tarangire area, which is more like over here. And then we head up to Lake Natron. We come back down to Karatu, and then we start heading all the way out to the Ngorongoro Crater, Serengeti National Park, before making our way back via a flight to Kilimanjaro Airport. And so, our key learning themes on this itinerary is really understanding the wildlife and ecosystem, as well as the different peoples that live in and around the wildlife centers of Tanzania's national park system. And we'll also be able to witness early signs of mankind by visiting the Oldupai Gorge, as well as our nonprofit partner, which is the Karatu Educational Fund. That supports Ganako's secondary school in Karatu. And so the town of Karatu is kind of the last big city before, and it's like a hub city before people start heading out to the Ngorongoro crater, as well as the Serengeti and the other national parks like Lake Manyara and Tarangire that are south. But within that area, there's only one librarian, and so the Kratu Educational Fund helps to support not only a library but a scientific lab at the school as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So we arrive, the first day is arriving at Mount Kilimanjaro Airport. You may or may not see the mountain depending on the time you arrive and the cloud cover. But Mount Kilimanjaro, as most of you may know, is actually the largest freestanding mountain, the tallest mountain above sea level in the world. And so after we hit the airport, we take you to a lodge that is in the Arusha region. And then we head out on the next day to Tarangire National Park. And it's actually one of my favorite parks as far as safari goes. It has one of the largest elephant populations in Tanzania. It has 3 to 4 different types of climates. There's savanna and there's a dry forest as well that you'll be able to see, and you'll see all kinds of mammals and bird life there. Day 3, we head up northeast straight up to the Lake Natron area. We spend a couple of days there, and Lake Natron is known for a breeding grounds for East Africa's flamingos, they gather there between August and October. We will also spend time in a Maasai Boma and really learning the day in the life of the Maasai tribe and the people that live there, and understand what the importance of a boma is. Your family may have the opportunity to see daggers being made with the local Maasai blacksmith, understand the role of women, and understand kind of their making of the jewelry, the beautiful collars and cuffs that they make, and what those symbolize and how they're important in their community. And so that will be a full day there, as well as there'll be some time to walk to a local waterfall that's near Lake Tron with our local guide, as well as part of the Maasai community. And then after we leave Lake Natron and spend time up there, we actually also head back down into Karatu, and this is the day that we spend time at the Ganako Secondary School. And again, the Karatu Educational Fund helps support the school in building a new library. The picture of the woman on the right is Rahema. She is the only librarian in the entire Karatu area that supports 700 students. And as well. There is a scientific lab that was built there on the school grounds as well, and that's what the Karatu Educational Fund is our partner and all about. So we'll be spending time with them there. And then the next day, we head out to the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, and we'll depart on it's about a 2 hour drive up to the crater. And we'll get everyone situated in our next lodge, and then we'll have lunch, and then we will head down into the crater. And visiting the crater is all about timing. If you typically go early in the morning before lunch, it tends to be very crowded. The first time I went there, I was a little disappointed because it felt like I was on I-5 with back-to-back safari vehicles and a lot of telephoto lenses. And so we choose to go after lunch. And it's almost lunch and then going into dusk time before the park closes, because you will see more animals as dusk starts to happen. And so we'll spend time in the crater in the afternoon and before dinner time. And so that's our time in the Ngorongoro crater. And then after that, on day 7 and 8, we spend time in Serengeti National Park. And on the way to Serengeti, we will visit the Oldupai Gorge. And Serengeti, for those who are unfamiliar, is also known as kind of the place where land moves on forever. And when you stand upon a stony outcrop and just you can see for miles and miles and miles, you know really why it gets its name. And so along the way, before we get to Serengeti, we will stop at the Oldupai Gorge, which is in the Maasai language, the Ma language, it's known as the place of wild sisal. So it's kind of like that wild grass. But it's the place where the first family of paleontology, the Leakeys, did a lot of their work back in 1968. This skull is a skull of Twiggy, which is known to be almost 2 million years old. And so that's why this area is so significant. And so what's really neat for kids to see is the different skeletons that were found of not only people, but also animals that were in the area, and the different sizes that giraffes were then compared to what they are now, and elephants and so forth. So it's a really neat place to stop. And this is just an example of the endless plains of the Serengeti and a couple of animals you may see along the way on the safari. And then lastly, in Tanzania, so we have the optional extension of staying on and visiting Lake Manyara National Park. And Lake Manyara National Park is known most famously for being along the Great Rift Valley Wall on the opposite side of the Ngorongoro crater. It has Lake Manyara, which is a soda lake, which is also known for flamingos, but it doesn't have the same minerals that Lake Natron does. It has about 5 different microclimates within it, so you'll see all kinds of different flora and fauna, as far as like amphibians go and mammals as well. It's also known for where you might see tree climbing lions. And so that is our experience in Tanzania. And our partners on this trip are Tanzania Journeys and the Karatu Educational Fund. And then our last adventure in Africa includes Zimbabwe. And this is 9 days and 8 nights. And we start off in Victoria Falls, and we spend most of our time after that in Hwange National Park. And the key learning themes of, or let me backtrack for a second, sorry. Most of our time will be spent in Zimbabwe in the uppermost northwestern corner of the country, which borders Botswana and Zambia, as well as on the very tip is Namibia. But we'll be spending most of our time in Hwange National Park in Victoria Falls. And the key learning themes of this tour includes understanding the wildlife and ecosystems of Zimbabwe's World Heritage Sites and national parks, which actually include Victoria Falls, the Zambezi River, areas near the Batoka Gorge, and Hwange National Park. And we'll talk a little bit about Zambezi National Park. We actually started this tour in support of the Africa Painted Dog, and so one of our partners is the Painted Dog Research Trust. and we'll be visiting that facility and those grounds after we leave Victoria Falls, and also really getting to know the cultural traditions of Zimbabwe's people, including some of the Ndebele ethnic group and more. But our first stop is actually Victoria Falls town. Upon arrival, we'll be staying in a garden type lodge that gets you out of the hustle and bustle of Victoria Falls town. And then our second day, we'll be having a private tour, a tour of Victoria Falls, also known as the Smoke That Thunders. And this is a more relaxing day to kind of get your legs about you after your long flight and discover Victoria Falls town. And then the next day, we'll be heading out on our way after breakfast. We check out of the lodge and we head out to an area called Sazinda, which is where the Painted Dog Research Trust is found. And this organization was founded by Dr. Greg Rasmussen almost over 30 years ago. And his main mission was to protect the African wild dog, which is one of the more, we know that almost every species is endangered these days, but it was actually more endangered than lions and other species on the continent. And so he works all over southern Africa, but all over wherever the painted dog actually originally migrated from, which is much farther north and west, actually. And so we'll spend some time learning about the painted dog species and
Hey,
learning
Kelly,
about.
we have a question. Sorry to
Oh,
interrupt, but
that's okay.
Juliana asked, how do you find, secure your nonprofit partners within a country and community?
So basically, we do a little bit of research. And actually, for example, a Painted Dog Research Trust, we had actually heard about someone locally here in Seattle who was doing some work with them. And then we do a lot of kind of vetting around and asking a lot of questions with other colleagues and partners, try to get an idea of how they're funded and most importantly, kind of what their needs are as well. And so we just kind of partner and focus on. So the Painted Dog Research Trust also had a relationship with our lodging and accommodation partner on the ground because everyone there is local, right? And so we look for like-mindedness. We look for kind of vetting them to make sure that they're legitimately a nonprofit, and really just really try to learn and discover what their needs are and how can we help support their efforts.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. Oftentimes, there are a lot of nonprofit partners here in the U.S. that have relationships with in other countries too. So that's kind of how we oftentimes do the due diligence around the local nonprofits too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Julia. Is there? I feel like there's another one up there. Hold on a second. Nope. Thanks. Um, and so what was I mentioning? So that's actually, and so Painted Dog Research Trust. There was actually a Painted Dog Research Trust in the U.S. And since then, that's kind of evolved into something else. But we still really support and love what Dr. Rasmussen is doing. In fact, he comes to the U.S. once a year, usually in the spring, and does a lot of speaking engagements and also fundraising. And one of the things that he has developed with his board and some local support is actually the first primary school that's really focused on around STEM, but also really kind of helps to create a pathway for local youth to become the next group of scientists and biologists in the area. So it's very much a conservation and biology kind of science focused school. So after we visit Dr. Rasmussen at the Painted Dog Research Trust, we actually start heading into Northern Wenge National Park and starting to spend time there. And so the bulk of our trip is split between northern and southern, and this is the time. What's unique about Wenge National Park, I've mentioned Kruger National Park in South Africa, the Serengeti. Being in Wenge, you see everything, but you don't have the crowds, and so that's kind of what's unique about this park and the difference that's there. You can pretty much see almost every, I think on our trip there, we saw almost every mammal kind of on our like animal list, so to speak. And there's a lot of different unique ways to have those experiences. And one of them includes getting out of a car and actually doing a safari from northern Wenge down to southern Wenge via the railway, which is the national railway. And it's just outside the border of Wenge National Park. And it's about a 3 hour drive or train ride down. And as you can see, just crossing the train in front and behind of the train is elephants and lions. And so you'll see a lot of different things along the way there. There's actually restroom facilities on the train, as well as there's snacks and refreshments on the train as well. And so that's a fun way to get down to get off the road and get down to the other part of the park. And so we spend 3 days. We spend about 2 days, 2.5 days in northern Wenge and about 3 days in southern Wenge. And again, with just different types of experiences that are in this national park that are a little bit different than other national parks. There's a very unique hide that is set up, which you'll see hides kind of in different places, but this from the outside looks like an anthill, and it's just next to a watering hole where elephants come to refresh every day. And so being at eye level with a group of elephants is a pretty different experience. And our community experiences in Wenge National Park actually happen in the south, which is why we have a little bit more time there. And so we will be stopping to visit Ngunyana village, as well as the Ngamo School, the Ngamo Wildlife Sanctuary, and the Community Rhino Sanctuary. Our partner in Zimbabwe does a really great job of making sure the communities that live outside the park have a voice in what happens in the park. And a lot of the accommodations that are inside the park are actually on communally owned land with the tribes outside the park. And they have a say in how lodges are built, what activities happen in the park, and they actually get, there's programs to get the kids that live outside the park in the park. I mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't realize that people who live outside of national parks have never even stepped into a national park in most cases. And so this example is like the opposite of that, which is one thing that got Jennifer and I really energized around the lodge partner that we work with. The owner of that partner happened to be back in the 70s, happened to be a ranger in Wenge National Park. So he kind of fully understands what's happened in the past and how to make that more inclusive today. Well, if you have questions about what I've covered so far or interested in one of our destinations, I can be reached at Kelly K. McCoy at globalfamilies.com. Jennifer, do you mind just throwing that in the chat?
Sure.
As well as our website is globalfamilytravels.com, and you can see all the destinations and the detailed itineraries there as well. But are there any other questions that I can answer before I keep moving on out there? Nope.
Okay. We've been to most of these places except Tanzania, and we've got somebody working on Tanzania with us at the moment, but they are all great. You've done a great job. The only thing I would add is Kruger is spelt without an E, and Olduvai is spelled with a V instead of a P for your presentation. Otherwise, your presentation is excellent.
Oh, well, thank you. And I always forget that on Kruger, and we actually there are two different spellings for Olduvai or Olduvai. But thank you for that. I appreciate that.
It should be with a V.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah, we may continue. I just wanted to make sure in case we get cut off by the event thing. So
yeah. So during our time in southern Wenge National Park at Ngunyana Village, we actually visit with the homestead leader, Mr. and Mrs. Nkube, and he actually sits on the communal board that also kind of helps to drive what happens in their particular village and the impacts that happen in the park as far as experiences, etc. And then some of the places that we will visit during our time in the park include the Ngamo Plains. And so, if you are familiar with Discovery Channel documentaries as well as National Geographic, and if you've seen any wildlife um, um, documentaries in the plains, more than likely they were filmed at the Ngamo Plains in Zimbabwe. And that generally usually is a walking safari through the plains, and which is really cool because you will decide if you want to see, if you want to be on the same level as, say, a water or a buffalo, or see the remains of an elephant up close that died naturally. And those are the kind of experiences that you would have on a walking safari versus being in a vehicle. So you see things a little bit more up close. What's really new for Wenge National Park in this community, with the help of Envelo Lodges, is just in the summer, fall, or earlier this summer, they opened a rhino sanctuary, and we're able to relocate rhinos that were at risk into the park, and now there is a sanctuary there. And so you'll have the opportunity to visit that as well. And so there's always something that's new that's helping the community and helping connect people to nature, visitors to Zimbabwe as well as locals. And that's why we like this partner so much. And so that pretty much is our Zimbabwe experience. And as I mentioned, our partners are the Painted Dog Research Trust, as well as Envelo Safari Lodges. And that's how to have a meaningful experience in Africa. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Jennifer, is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up, if there are no more questions?
No, thank you, Kelly. Really enjoy always seeing these beautiful pictures and reliving Africa. So feel free to reach out, and we'll put this recording on our website, and follow up with all of those who have been registered, and we look forward to connecting with you personally. Thank you for joining us.